It is homecoming day for world leaders. There's no football game, but just go with me on the analogy here because it's a major international meeting with some potentially high stakes. So I call it homecoming day because homecoming is when you have a big event that gathers a lot of different people. And that's what's happening at the United Nations. And it's actually playing right behind me here. You can watch it live as world leaders step to the microphone. So I want to tell you three quick things about the United Nations, and then we're going to hop off because President Biden is going to be speaking shortly. And I want to explain why we're even paying close attention to what's happening at the United Nations. So here's three things you should know. Number one, the United Nations was founded really in the aftermath of World War I and World War II. You remember the global community is emerging from these deadly, destructive conflicts. And there was a question about, whether or not there's a better way. Is there a better way to solve issues than these huge world wars? That idealism is part of the foundation of the United Nations. And that is critical to what we're watching here as we're watching diplomacy really on live television. So at the beginning, in the 1940s, the UN had about 50 members. Now it has 193. And for most of its existence, the United Nations was in New York City. That's where it's headquartered. The very first preliminary meeting was actually in San Francisco. And even then, there was a debate about who's sitting with who and how are people going to act together. And that's why in some ways we can call it the homecoming. You're going to see what is described often in the news as UNGA. Do you see this? This is the UN General Assembly, and this is the second thing you should know. The UN General Assembly it usually takes place annually. It didn't happen last year because of the pandemic, but it's a major meeting of world leaders. And yes, it's important in that you're having a lot of high profile people come together. But just like homecoming, when you're kind of looking around and watching what people are wearing, it's sort of the same way. We're going to be watching how world leaders are behaving. We're going to be watching their tone and their posture as much as their messaging. Right now, you're going to have world leaders step to the microphone and they have this open invitation to talk about whatever they want to talk about in any way they want to talk about it. What they choose to talk about, how they choose to talk about it matters. And also what we're watching is what happens on the sidelines, speaking of football, right? It's not just what happens on the playing field when everybody's watching, it's what's happening on the sidelines. Which leaders are going to kind of pull off and have coffee together and talk? Sometimes that's unexpected, sometimes that's newsworthy, and that's what we're going to be watching. So today, President Biden, along with others, will be speaking. They're going to be speaking throughout the whole week, but today, which is really the opening of this General Assembly, this is when we're going to be paying really close attention, and then we'll watch the next several days. Okay, final thing you should know, and this is really important if you're an American citizen, but really for anybody around the world, how is the United Nations funded? The United Nations is funded by contributions from member nations. Contributions that are obligated but also voluntary. And when it comes down to it, there's sort of like this complicated calculation of who gives what. The United States has the largest economy in the world, and so we give the most, but we also voluntarily contribute to United Nations programs. And at the end of the day, it's about 20%, a fifth of the United Nations overall budget. And that's really important to note because even though the UN was funded on these ideals that maybe we can bring around world peace if we can all get together in a common place and talk to each other, there's a question about how effective the United Nations is when it comes to that goal. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're hosting a dinner party and you're one of the major sponsors and you got friends, you got acquaintances, and I don't want to say you got enemies, but you got some people maybe you're a little bit more skeptical of, and you're paying for dinner. But you're finding that some people are actually mean to your friends. And you're like, what's up with that? Like, I'm paying for this. I'm paying for you guys to behave this way. I know that sounds like kind of a light example, but that's some of the dynamics that play with the United Nations. It's like, well, wait a minute. Is this really advancing American interests? And no, the United Nations is not funded, is not created for purely American interests. But if you're contributing a lot of money, you're contributing time, you're contributing resources, there is a question about whether or not it's effective and worthwhile. And that's an assessment that will happen on any number of projects, but it does happen as well with the UN. So you should be aware of that. Yes, there's idealism. Yes, there's those that say the United Nations is critical for especially humanitarian aid and response. There are those that are more skeptical and say, well, wait a minute, how effective is the United Nations really when it comes to peace and creating the dynamics that we want in a peaceful world? is it actually advancing that? So those are a couple things that you should know for today. I'm going to be watching President Biden, what he has to say, and I probably have it in the background all day. So I'll pull anything that I think is important for you, little edits and highlights, just to keep you aware of what's going on. But that's your quick debrief on the United Nations. Homecoming for world leaders. A lot of suits, not a lot of dresses, no football, but I hope that analogy works for you, right? Big meeting, a lot of folks getting together, and we're watching, yes, the details of the event, but we're also keeping an eye on the bigger picture overall. All right, questions and comments, let me know. More on this on smarternews.com. Have a great day, everybody. I'll talk to you soon.